Okay, video 3. So thank you for sitting through everything so far. I'm going to make this one as quick as I can. The options here now are talking about what you're physically going to be asked to make for this and for all of the assignments as the semester goes on. So the process is also going to be a very critical, we'll call it a tool in your tool belt. The process by which you are creating your illustrations will be important because you always need to have consistency on some level in your life. I know some people thrive on chaos and love constant change. I know some people really like the idea of mixing things up from time to time to prevent stagnation. I'm not asking you to throw any of that stuff away. I am, however, saying is that not only do you need to know your own mind, know how long it takes you to do things, know how much you're going to charge to do those things, but you also need to know how to effectively begin and then get your way to the end of an assignment, which includes sending off the finished final artwork and then billing for it. In this little, we'll call it tutorial, is to take you through the steps about what you should be doing and what I feel should be the most important things you do consistently for every single assignment, always. Not only for this class, but for every class and for every professional project you ever work on, ever. So, let me reduce my video again and kind of jump you into that space. So using again our assignment number 1 as the main test bed for this, let's go this way. Step number 1 should always be to build a mood and flavor board. You can look at this as reference gathering. It sort of is, but it's more specific than that. Mood and flavor board is things like using Pinterest or Google or other internet sources. You can use physical sources. I used to use things like Workbook and other physical tomes they would print and send to me on a monthly basis to look through stock photography and just general samples or other existing artwork. You would use anything that's available to you, including things like just color samples, words like written blurbs from an actual book, music if it incites a certain evocative feeling, or anything that best defines who you feel your audience is. All of the imagery that I'm asking you to assemble is something that they use in the professional world to figure out a way to map out who your audience is. Now, you will do this basically for every single illustration you ever create. There are versions of this. I'll get into those later. But for right now, imagine it this way. Every illustration you create, including this assignment number 1, Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf, once you know who your audience is in your mind, I'm now asking you to build a mood and flavor board of just random things. 20, 30 different photographs that you just randomly assemble that kind of together provide a feeling for what your audience is. And that will provide the roadmap you need to conduct the entire illustration. It might seem like a waste of time, but here's why it's absolutely critical. You want to use this opportunity to include things like mood and flavor and things that you find appealing and that you wish to pursue. And the reason that you are doing this is because when you send those things off to the client, you want them to have an opportunity to react to this mood and flavor board. You want them to be able to look at this shared journey, this map that you've built of just random collaged things, and for them to be like, oh yeah, that looks great. Oh, I don't like that. That's a little too specific, or that's too adult, or that's too childish. You want them to look at your mood and flavor board and feel like you together are collaborating and building a literal roadmap so that you can be in the same place at the same time. That is the reason that you are doing this. And that is because before you start thumbnailing, before you start doing anything that involves physical creation process, you want your client to be able to be on your side immediately or as quickly as possible. If you provide thumbnails, here's just a for instance, if a client asks you to create Little Red Riding Hood and the Big Bad Wolf, as I am, and you just immediately send that client a group of thumbnails, there's something that happens in those thumbnails. The client looks at them and then says immediately to themselves what level of quality and cleverness they are already dealing with in you. In other words, they are prejudging and biasing you before you even created anything of substance. That can be a problem. Even if your thumbnails are glorious little micro illustrations of top quality, they might not be the quality that your illustrator, your client wants. So you're already putting yourself into an iffy gray space. So the way around that is the best way possible. Provide a mood and flavor board to your client so that they can say right off the bat, without even so much as bringing your creative cleverness into this equation, whether or not you're on the right page. What I'm showing you right now on the screen is an actual case study of my own. So backing up a little bit, the client was an author that wanted me to build a cover for her story. The story was aimed at young adult, so she already knows who the audience is and informed me, told me it's young adult. Young adult is a specific age group between roughly 16 and like 20 years old. It's a very subset of stories that is just after, we'll call it young adult teenagehood, and right before, we'll call it true adulthood. It's that space, that transitional time between when you are truly independent, so as college students, and then moving off into the world where you're about to begin a career. It's sort of in that moment. It's usually defined as when you are bridging topics that are a little too dark for children and begin to explore things like independence and death and significant loss and true emotional travesty. That's usually what defines young adult. You can go too young, you can go too old, but that's my general space. So the author told me this, and then told me also that what the story is about a love triangle between a man and a woman and another man who they're all kind of like bouncing off of each other to attract each other, if that makes any sense. The traditional classic love triangle. The story takes place in the 1960s, specifically during the Vietnam era, so maybe more like 1970 something, and also takes place in a very specific real world all boys school in Indiana, which name I can't remember. The story is basically one where one of the three is murdered, specifically by being tied to a tree, not hung, but just simply tied to a tree and then left for dead. I'll get into that in a second. So the story is kind of dark, and it has a very specific moral core to it, which comes later in the story. But knowing that it was meant to be for young adults, when I first started embarking on the kinds of material that I needed to show to the client or to the author to find out if I was on the right page, was to find samples of a style that author already enjoyed. This is a client that I have never worked with before. So since she and I are coming at each other cold, where we don't know what we're interested in and what preferences we both have, or ultimately what we're trying to find, we need to start someplace. That's the point. So I've got this mood and flavor board that shows different types of work. I've got things that are slightly photorealistic. I've got things that are slightly more, dark goth romance, things that are a little bit more high and lofty style, romanticism. I've got graphic design style pieces here that are not really illustrated so much as graphically designed. Things that are more illustrative in terms of like almost posterly. This one is almost photographic in the way that it was built. Each of these are very similar to each other in that they kind of have like young adult, early adult themes. At the same time, they are all very different in terms of their style. I was looking specifically from the author to inform me what kind of a style appeals to her specifically. And she did. So after submitting this to her, she wrote back and said, I found these three to be specifically my favorites. The moonless option, the fallen option, and this clockwork dagger option. So that kind of told me that they were looking for something that uses photorealistic elements. And since two of the three at the very least specifically were around showing the person, that they wanted something that was more narrative. They didn't want symbolic, where it was just an item floating in space. They wanted actual characters to be represented. Cool. So I made a second mood and flavor board with that information. and it was these items here. So this is the specific actual building that is being featured in the story, the Boys Academy. This is some mood and flavor imagery that was being pulled directly out of the Vietnam era, the helicopters that were of that time period. Although these characters aren't specific for their faces or their body types or anything, but they were just being shown as the costumed elements for men and women of that time. In the upper right-hand corner here, I've got two boys who actually attend that school, showing the actual uniform of the men that go to this school. So the uniform was an important aspect. One of the men in the book was wheelchair bound, so that was an important element. And then she also expressed some interest of this very creepy crossroads of a hallway / staircase that was the epicenter of her story. And after having read half the book, the staircase was referred to an awful lot. So I decided that maybe I would throw that in there as well, just to see if maybe there was some purpose to maybe pursuing that path. I sent all of this now, storyboard number 2, back to the client, and they were really happy. Everything about this was really exactly what they wanted. So I now had enough flavor to begin working on thumbnails. This opportunity of creating 2 storyboards or 2 mood and flavor boards gave me and the client an opportunity to bond, to share some ideas, and more importantly, get the client on my side, because I wanted them to be able to see that my head was already in the right place, that we were considering the right things to be important and symbolic and generally useful to the story that we wanted to tell. So once we are now on the same side, there's a camaraderie. Now, when I start sending over thumbnails, my thumbnails can be kind of weak, because now that we know what we're dealing with, we know that we don't put as much pressure on the actual pencil strokes that make my thumbnails. Hopefully that makes sense. The thumbnails do less work now because we already know we're on the same page. Here are those thumbnails. So I'm asking you to develop roughly 10 as a minimum for your first assignment. 20 is ideal, 10 is the minimum. Once you've successfully identified your audience and all the things we've gone through, please create your Little Red Riding Hood thumbnails. For this book, for my client, these are my existing thumbnails. To be honest with you, these are kind of crap. This is not what I normally do. These are all pretty simple. Some of them are indeed quite symbolic, such as these upper right-hand couple. I was choosing the idea of using things like Lily to show like a dead soldier's face. I was looking at using the inverted up and down, like there really is no good and bad. There's just result and counter result as a possible symbolic expense. I showed the example of the staircase where it was such an epicenter to the story. And after going through a lot of these samples, the one that she really drew back on was these upper top pieces here, where you actually showed the student in the crisis of the moment where they were tied to the tree and effectively left for dead. So it's important that you understand that this is not race-driven. This is really more around just a bad scenario that unfolded badly. And as a result of that, there was a lot of contention around the idea, do we really want to show a person strapped to a tree? Because symbolically, historically, contextually, that brings up a lot of really racially poignant moments from time and history, things like lynchings and some really horrible stuff. Do we really want to get that close to the line on the cover of your book? Which is why I tried it and immediately walked away from it and tried to do other things. The clients, and then talking to their editor, came back and they said they absolutely want to try these more hard-hitting images. So I was a little surprised by that, to be honest with you. So I was like, okay. So we went back and forth and talked about how to make this both morally important, but also to stay away from the more racially divisive version of what something like this could look like, which was a trick, to be sure. So step 3 was all around developing what that looked like. Now, I didn't show, unfortunately, in this series what my photographic reference looked like, but I've already collected a lot of it in the mood and flavor board from a couple of screens ago. So in step 3, it's to develop thumbnails, or once the thumbnail's developed, is to approve that thumbnail into more of a final drawing. So we're not there yet in a class. I want to see your mood and flavor board and potentially your thumbnails if you're willing to go that far. Once I have gotten your thumbnails, then you and I can approve which one of those thumbnails is the best one to move forward on. That follows more closely the traditional experience of a working relationship between illustrator and client. So in this one, I want you to start developing your thumbnails. Email me, chat with me, Zoom call me. We'll go through those things. We'll approve the ones that we like or revisit the ones that need some work. And then you'll begin on your final drawing. Once you start your final drawing, then you're incorporating all of your reference. You're dealing with actually assembling the scene. This version is probably the third attempt at getting what the client wanted. And it kind of backs off a little bit. It zooms away from it to really show more of the grounds and use the figure as really more of like a footnote more than an actual primary focus, if that makes sense. It was really more to do with the size relationship in this image. I'm also deliberately leaving the upper right-hand portion of the page open for the title. So as I go into that, here was the line drawing, and then I brought the title into that. I also use this opportunity to reflect where I want my light sources to be. So you've got your moon through the trees in the background here, and these creamy colors are where I wanted the light to really be trickling through from the building. Once that was approved, then I just started moving on to actually completing the piece. I do not show my client literally every single stage. Not only does that just open up a huge can of worms, but unless the client specifically asked me to do that, there's just no reason to bog them down with those details. Once you're over the hurdle of getting the final drawing approved, hopefully they know enough about you and your normal style anyway that they kind of know where you're going to wind up. So at that point, it's just a matter of you being the professional to get your work completed and to show them the final project when it's closer to being done, roughly the 80% mark. So for you personally, the next stage is just simply moving in through the chain of system that you need to go through to get the process completed. For me, that involves putting in all of my flats. So in this case, here's that image. The creamy color is still there representing the light source. I moved the moon over a little bit to see what that looked like. It was no longer through the trees so much as it was off the side. The dark, almost monochromatic gradient that runs through representing the general tone for the nighttime, early morning sky. And then I use that in the very next stage. A lot has happened since then, but what you're effectively looking at is I overlaid a simple texture to create the sky. And then I also converted a lot of these individual facets into simple one color flat colors. So anything that was facing a certain direction became one color. Anything that faced an opposite direction became another color. And I'm basically just trying to follow the sense of light directionality as much as I possibly can. The foreground was the darkest of all of those shapes, since it, in this case, was the farthest away from the light source. In this case, both the moon and the building, which both provide back rear lighting. And since this item is technically in the foreground, it's the reason why it's also one of the darkest shapes, to really hold your attention and to separate itself a little bit more from the background. After I kind of figured out where those things were going to go, I then started working on details. So for me, most illustrators and most instructors will always tell you, try to work in your background and then work your way forward. There are lots of reasons for this. In terms of lighting, that helps you really set up your palette. It really helps you figure out light directionality. It really helps you figure out the scene overall. And it's just general good form, because especially when you're working traditionally, more often than not, your medium has to be built up in layers, and it's really hard to, for example, paint with oil in between every single little branch and twig and still make it feel like that background is obeying some level of gradient. It's difficult, it's extra work. It makes more sense to lay the gradient down first and then paint over top of that to build everything up. The second most important reason why you want to work with your background is because, let's face it, most of us prefer to work with the fun stuff. Your characters, the primary foreground, things that are truly the absolute focus of your illustration in the first place. You want to jump right into that. Everybody wants to go and work in the background, if at all, second. And when that happens, your background usually suffers for all sorts of reasons. It's not very imaginative, it's shoddily composed, it needs work or whatever. So what this will do is that when you work with your background, you're actually reserving creative energy so that when you actually get to the thing that's the most important and fun for you, you will have psychologically reserved enough interest and creativity that you will dump all of that energy into building the thing you really wanted, which should ultimately leave you with two good things: a really good background and a really good subject. So that's what I sort of did here. And then through that, then I started working my way forward. So I got a lot of detail into the tree that looks really too texture heavy, but that's okay, because what I was going to do next was start pushing everything back. So the texture got all worked in, and then I started working on lighting. So now this is where I'm starting to round the form a little bit and kind of turn the shapes and make them feel a bit more cylindrical, like the light's only hitting certain parts of the branches and the trunk. And then I started working in the detail. So I did jump over the building a little bit, and now I'm kind of working into the middle background here. So I spent some time working up the brick and the masonry, and it's not extremely detailed. So if I zoom in on that a little bit, you'll see that what I'm kind of dealing with here is it's just really mostly flat colors. I did also bring in some shapes directly using layers in Photoshop and lightly manipulated them to kind of dust in the brick. All the rest of it was more or less just painted using just flat colors with simple gradients. The next stage after that, of course, was then start worrying about the foreground, which is now our male. So we got him. He's shirtless, as he was in the book. He's got his dog tags hanging from his neck, bound to the tree, and then we're starting to work up the details there. So at this stage, I just kind of continued to follow the same gradient pattern, light directionality as it was in the rest of the scene, and then also laid down the text as to where they wanted it. What you're looking at right now is the final cover. This is what was sent to the publisher with all the various needs and various file types, and then that got published and printed. After they ran the very first run, the editor had cold feet. They came back and they said, we've already put out our first several thousand books, and we feel like maybe it was a miscalculation to have the character strapped to the tree as we had agreed to. So 2 lessons here. 1, changes can absolutely occur even after the project is done. And the second most critical one is that you absolutely need to make sure that your client is in the conversation as early and as long as possible, because if I had shown this client nothing and then just delivered a final project, I would be on the hook 100% for a cover that they ultimately didn't like. If that is true, guess who gets stuck with all of the fallout? It's not them. They're not going to take responsibility for something they can push off onto somebody else. That would be me. And now that's a big problem for me. That means I don't get the job. It means that if there are any changes to be made, I'm not getting paid for those. It might mean that if there was a lawsuit and they got sued, that now that might be my fault because I just gave them something without consulting them. So there's lots of small, somewhat scary ways where you need to be concerned and really make sure that you kind of overcome that initial fear of talking to clients, because you really want them bought in. That's why storyboards are important. That's why thumbnails are important. That's why final drawings before you paint them are important. You want to show them these things along the way. So the client was very gracious. They came back and they said, listen, we know it's not your fault. We know we worked with you. We know we asked you to go down this path. So we need to pay you to make some changes. And they did. And the changes were this. It was a very simple thing. The original fear was that the client might be stuck with an all-new cover that was 100% from scratch, a brand new build. I said, no, that's not a problem. We'll figure something else out. So I decided to go with the moment that the student was actually found after he had been left outside. So it was the very next moment in succession. And in many ways, that for me really improved the quality of this piece, because now there is a moment of time that has taken place. The rope is still left hanging. It is still a centrally located primary prop. You've got this long, kind of brooding, almost classic noir shadow happening here, which is a great element to have in your illustration. And the primary silhouette really has no true detail, but the function of what's happening is pretty clear. A person is being carried into the building. So you throw those three symbols together and you've got a very clear sense of what is just happening and what's happening. So that was a really improvement, in my opinion, to the cover of the book, and has subsequently become the new cover and is what is existing today if you were to go look on Amazon. So that's really probably the most important process to show you is you need to do the storyboards, the mood and flavor boards, get those approved. Then you work on thumbnails, get those approved. Then you do final drawing, get those improved. And then once that's done, the rest of the middle space is really yours to complete. And then if you want to show the client something closer to done before it's actually done, that might not be a bad idea. But at least now, by that point, you're all on the same page. It's not a surprise anymore. The real danger to including your clients all the way through the process, every single stage, is that they will absolutely have opinions and they will drive you nuts with changes and color tweaks and what about this isms, and you'll wind up with a lot of pain. So it's really my recommendation to the first three steps: storyboard, thumbnail, drawing, and then once that's approved, kind of go off into your own corner, do as much of the painting as possible, and then show them something at like the 85-90% mark, and then finish it. And the very last piece I'm not going to get into right now, but that's something we addressed in the very first video, which is around billing. So in my brief, you'll see a long comment about generating a quote and how to do it. At the end of the day, the only things you really need to know are the things that we talked about. How many hours did you take to work on that piece? What is your cost per hour? If you are a physical, traditional illustrator, what money did you have to spend buying supplies and materials for that piece? The canvas, the paint, the brushes, etc. You take these two values, your time and your time per hour, you multiply them, and then of course you take that value, you add it to anything that you may have had to pay for out of pocket, and at the very least, that's your value. And if you have any taxes or anything to add to that, that's another thing you have to add on. This is a very complicated subject. We'll get into more of that, of course, later as well. There's lots of notes in this page for you to consider if you need them. But you want your quote to be something that is going to cover your time, your expenses, and your sanity. If your client is a pain in the ass and they do not leave you alone and they are changing their minds constantly and are changing what they want constantly and are riding you over every detail constantly, I know you might be new to this space, but that does not mean it is your fault. There are so many clients out there that just don't know what they want until they see it. That is no way to work. You will lose so much money and sleep doing that. If you have a client like that, you might have to add in a pain in the ass tax. And that is something that is short term or shorthands basically for saying that if you're using our original sample of $360 at minimum wage for 40-hour illustration, and you add in, let's say, $100 for the actual canvas, so now you're at like roughly $460, round that up to $500, round that up to $600. Maybe that's what will offset the fact this client is going to add on an unforeseen 10 extra hours of work and changes and manipulations. You'll know more as you do more in the real world. But for right now, let's just keep it simple. How long did it take you? How much do you want for actual hours? Did you spend any money on this project? And if so, add that in, and let's just keep it there. Once your quote is done, then you would want to make sure you send that invoice off to your client. We'll talk about all that in depth later. But the process that I really want you to really concentrate on for assignment number 1 is give me a mood and flavor board, or 2 if necessary, and a set of thumbnails. And I want at least 10, 20 preferably. It's up to your time and how much sanity you have to work on this. Get those approved by me, and then we can work on to your final illustration. Send all that stuff to me by email, by chat, by text, by Zoom call. I don't care. Email might be the easiest. And that's it. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And we'll see you on the next video, and keep creating.